Hello, my wonderful 9th grade students. Welcome to our video on finding inverse functions. Our standards are listed below, and so is your objective. Today we will learn how to undo functions in order to find the inverse of the function. I just want to go over a quick review of what we have learned about inverse functions so far. As you can see, we have a function and its inverse represented on the graph. We learned that the inverse of the function reflects over the line y equals x, which you can see demonstrated on the graph. As you can see by the tables, when this reflection happens, the x and y coordinates switch places. First, we're going to practice plugging x into a couple of equations. If we have f of x equals 2x plus 5, and we want to plug in 2 for x, I'm going to go ahead and plug in 2 for x. So let's talk about what we have to do first. Order of operations tells us that we have to do the multiplication before the addition. So 2 times 2 equals 4, and then we add the plus 5 at the end. So 4 plus 5 equals 9. Therefore, f of 2, this should have been a 2 over here as well, f of 2 equals 9. Now let's look at part B. F of negative 2 equals 32. Okay everyone, box number 3 is asking, what is happening to x? We are going to create a list of the order of operations that affect x. The very first operation that affects x is plus 4. Next, we square the quantity. Then we subtract 8, and lastly, we divide by 2. Okay, so now we are going to get into actually building the inverse function. So we've already made our step-by-step list, and we saw this in box number 3. In order for us to build our inverse function, we have to understand what to do with our original step-by-step list. Not only do we have to undo the operations, but we have to represent the inverse as a reflection of the original function. The first thing that we need to do is we need to undo the operations that are happening in our original step-by-step list. So how could we possibly undo plus 4? We would minus 4. And how could we undo squaring something? If we have a quantity squared, how could we cancel that out? It is indeed a square root. Okay, how do we undo a minus 8? Plus 8. And how do we undo a divided by 2? We times 2. Okay, we have completed the undo stage of building an inverse function. The second step is to reverse the order the steps come in. What I mean by reverse is instead of going from top to bottom, we're going to go from bottom to top. So I'm going to take my step 4 and make it my step 1. So our step number 1 is now times 2. Our step 2 is plus 8. Our step 3 is the square root. And our step 4 is minus 4. Okay, now we are ready to create our inverse function. So you're probably asking, why in the world are we making these steps? What does this mean? How does this create the inverse function? Well, if we take a look at our step-by-step list over here, our step-by-step list represents the operations that are happening to x. So if I were to try to recreate the equation that's at the top, I would look at my steps. I could start with x and say, okay, step 1 says plus 4. So I'm going to add 4 to x. Now it says I have a quantity squared. Now, some would say, oh, then I just have to square x. But when we're going by steps, each step takes into account all the steps that came before it. So if it says quantity squared, we have to square the entire quantity. Next, step 3 says that we have to minus 8. So we're going to take away 8 from the entire quantity. And lastly, step 4 says we divide by 2. So we're going to divide the entire quantity by 2. And that is indeed f of x. So if this creates the f of x equation, then our steps over here in the red must create our inverse. So let's try to do that. Let's start with x. Now, our first step says that we have to multiply by 2. We can write this 2 ways. We could write times 2, or we could write 2x. I'm going to write 2x. Our next step says we have to add 8 to the entire quantity, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Then it says we have to square root the entire quantity. So I'm going to square root the entire quantity. And then it says, lastly, I have to take away 4 from the entire quantity. And this is indeed our inverse function of x. Okay, now that we have learned how to build our inverse function, we are going to do an example. Here we have f of x equals the square root of x minus 7 plus 5. Notice that the plus 5 is on the outside. So we are going to work on creating the step-by-step list. So step number 1, we want to ask ourselves, what is happening to x first? If I plugged in a number for x, what is the first operation that I would complete? It is -7. Then we want to ask ourselves, what is step 2? What would act on x second? It is a square root. Lastly, we want to ask ourselves, what is the last thing that happens to x? And that is +5. Okay, so now we are going to go through our steps. The first step is to undo all of these operations. So how would we undo -7? +7. How would we undo a square root? Now, if you remember from a couple past lessons, we know how to undo square roots. We can square them, so we're going to write this as a quantity squared. And lastly, how do we undo a +5? We -5. But we're not done yet. We have to reverse the steps. Instead of going from top to bottom, we're going to go from bottom to top. So our first step will be -5, our second step will be quantity squared, and our third step will be +7. Now we have to create the equation. So when we create the equation, every time we do this, we start with x, and then we complete the operations that tell us what to do. So it says the first thing that happens to x is that we -5. The next thing that happens to the entire quantity is that we square it, and the last thing that happens to the entire quantity is that we +7. So f inverse of x equals the quantity of x -5 squared plus 7. Okay, time for a checkpoint. I would like everyone to try to create a step-by-step operations list for f of x, and then use the process that we learned in the previous boxes to create the inverse function. Good luck!